Welcome to the deep dive. If you're joining us today, you are likely a fellow learner. You know, someone who is always eager for a really thrilling narrative deconstruction.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you know that specific electric feeling when you open a book, and within the space of just a few paragraphs, the author has completely trapped you in their world.
Oh, it's the best. You literally cannot look away.
Right. Your resting heart rate spikes, and your mind is already working overtime, desperately trying to put the pieces together before the characters do. And today, we are taking a microscopic look at exactly that kind of literary experience. We're exploring the opening chapters of Sandra Brown's novel, Tough Customer.
And we aren't just going to be looking at this text as a passive story, although, I mean, it is a remarkably gripping one.
Yeah, for sure.
We're going to be dissecting it as a masterclass in psychological suspense, meticulous character building, and the very specific, very deliberate anatomy of a crime.
Exactly. It's a phenomenal text to deconstruct because it operates on so many levels simultaneously.
It really does. When you analyze Brown's writing in these opening pages, you're looking at the work of a seasoned architect of tension. Every single detail, from the color of a bedroom wall to the condensation on a glass, is load-bearing. Nothing is wasted.
Absolutely nothing. And just to establish the pedigree we are dealing with here, this novel comes from an author with a massive, genre-defining bibliography. We're talking about prior works like Rainwater, Smash Cut, and Fat Tuesday.
Heavy hitters.
Right. When a writer has spent decades producing complex thrillers, they aren't just writing stories anymore. They are refining the exact neurological science of keeping an audience on the edge of their seat.
They understand precisely when to drop a clue and when to pull the rug completely out from under you.
Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive. We are going to unpack exactly how that thriller hook functions. We're going to analyze how the author weaves together a violently disruptive, inciting incident, a truly terrifying psychological profile of a stalker, and a 30-year-old secret that forces a very reluctant, deeply flawed hero out of the shadows.
And what's fascinating here is how the text utilizes the concept of environmental contrast to build that initial tension. Throughout these opening chapters, we see this masterful juxtaposition of idyllic, everyday, completely relatable settings with sudden, explosive violence.
It's so jarring.
It is, because the author is constantly playing with our inherent cognitive biases. We expect bad things to happen in dark, dangerous places. By violating spaces that we code as safe, she masterfully strips away our sense of security. She gives you just enough visceral detail to make you feel like you're standing in the room, but holds back the broader context so that you, the listener, are forced to constantly recalibrate your theories.
Okay, let's unpack this by diving straight into the opening scene, because it is a textbook example of how to execute a cold open.
Oh, it really is.
We are in Merritt County, Texas. It's the prologue, and we're placed firmly over the shoulder of Deputy Ski Nyland as he arrives at a remote lake house in the dead of night. And the author uses incredibly specific, vivid sensory details to set the scene before a single line of dialogue is even spoken.
You really feel the atmosphere instantly.
Right. You have the pulsing emergency lights from the ambulance outside, sending these frantic artificial shafts of red and blue color into the surrounding ancient dark forest.
Yeah.
You have the physical auditory crunch of his boots in the gravel. And then he steps through the open front door into the house, and we are hit with this immediate, shocking juxtaposition.
Tell me about the specific layout of that interior, because the visual rhetoric of this house is doing a massive amount of heavy lifting for the narrative.
It is the absolute picture of cozy, unpretentious domesticity. It's a wide foyer leading into a perfectly homey living room. There's a slip-covered sofa. There's a stone fireplace, and because it's summer, someone has deliberately placed a leafy green fern in the grate to make it look inviting.
Such a specific domestic touch.
Exactly. There's a patchwork quilt neatly folded over an easy chair, and then the focal point on the coffee table, there are 2 empty wine glasses. And the author makes a very pointed effort to tell us that one glass has traces of lipstick on the rim, and the other one doesn't.
If we pause to analyze the psychology of that specific environment, this peaceful, incredibly normal domestic setup serves to profoundly amplify the shock of the violence that is waiting upstairs.
It really does.
By establishing this cozy, placid environment, the meticulously placed fern, the handmade quilt, the intimate remnant of lipstick on the wine glass, the author is signaling to the reader's subconscious that a sanctuary has been desecrated.
A total violation.
Precisely. In literature, the violated sanctuary trope is incredibly powerful because it preys on our most fundamental vulnerabilities. This wasn't a drug deal gone wrong in an abandoned warehouse. This is a home where two people were simply enjoying a quiet, intimate evening.
Yeah, they were just having a glass of wine.
Right. The violation of that safe space makes the crime feel infinitely more threatening because it's an environment you instantly recognize. The horror isn't just the blood. The horror is that the violence happened right next to a patchwork quilt.
That perfectly articulates why the transition upstairs feels so destabilizing. So Deputy Nyland hears noises and heads up the stairs to the second floor, stepping into a bedroom with pale, peach-colored walls.
Another soft, inviting detail.
Exactly. But the scene itself is grisly and chaotic. There's a man lying prone on the floor, and the clinical details are raw. He's been shot in the lower left torso, he's bleeding heavily into the rug, and he's wearing nothing but a pair of gray knit underwear, which the EMTs have had to physically cut away to treat this massive gunshot wound.
It's so vulnerable and brutal.
Very. And the EMTs inform the deputy that the victim's name is Ben Lofland. But this is exactly where the author introduces the first major narrative fracture.
The discrepancy in the identities here presents a fascinating puzzle. How does the text introduce this conflict to Nyland?
Well, the EMTs tell Deputy Nyland that the woman who called 911 in a panic is named Caroline King. They know this because that's the name registered in the county dispatch database for this specific lake house.
Okay, makes sense so far.
But when Deputy Nyland steps over Ben Lofland's bleeding body and looks into the attached master bathroom, the woman he finds hiding in there is definitively not Caroline King.
And the physical description of the woman in that bathroom is just a masterclass in portraying a traumatic freeze response.
It really is. The author paints such a stark, heartbreaking picture of her. She's sitting on the edge of the bathtub, entirely withdrawn into herself, just rocking back and forth in a classic self-soothing motion.
Total shock.
Yeah. Her auburn hair is soaking wet, hanging down like a heavy curtain to shield her face from the room. She's wearing a summer-weight cotton robe that's been carelessly, hastily tied, and because she was obviously interrupted in the middle of a shower, the robe is sticking to damp patches on her skin.
The vulnerability is just off the charts.
You can see pale freckles on her arms, highlighting her youth, and her bare, pink toes are curled deeply, almost defensively, into the pile of the bath mat. When Nyland gently asks for her name, she tells him she is Barry Malone.
So immediately the map doesn't work.
Not at all. She isn't Caroline King, the wealthy owner of the house who supposedly made the 911 call, and she doesn't share a last name with Ben Lofland, the man currently bleeding out on the bedroom floor just a few feet away.
And while the reader is completely absorbed in the profound vulnerability of Barry Malone, the wet hair, the curled toes, the obvious visceral state of psychological shock, the author drops a crucial chilling detail into the bottom of the frame.
Oh, this part gave me chills.
Right, just inches from Barry's vulnerable bare feet, lying quietly on the bathroom floor, is a .38 revolver, a classic Saturday night special. And the text specifically notes that the base of the commode would have kept this weapon completely hidden from the view of the frantic EMTs who rushed in earlier to save Ben.
So Deputy Nyland puts on a latex glove, carefully picks the gun up by the trigger guard, and checks it. The cylinder is completely full. There is an unspent bullet in every single one of the 6 chambers. He sniffs the barrel. It hasn't been fired recently.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the narrative technique being deployed here is absolutely brilliant. The author is actively manipulating your suspicion.
Totally.
You walked into this crime scene utterly convinced that the traumatized woman rocking on the edge of the bathtub is the pure, innocent victim of a horrific home invasion. But by placing that hidden, unfired gun right at her feet, the author immediately forces you to question Barry's role in the ecosystem of this crime.
You have to ask why.
Exactly. Why does she have a cheap, untraceable revolver in a luxury lake house?
Yeah.
Did she shoot Ben with a completely different gun and stash this one? Why did she deliberately keep this weapon hidden from the paramedics who were trying to help her partner?
And Nyland actually presses her on this. When he asks her point blank if she shot Ben, her reaction is pure, unfiltered horror. She vehemently denies it, claiming she didn't dig the pistol out of her belongings until after she called 911, entirely because she was terrified the attacker would come back to finish the job.
Which is a plausible defense, given her state of panic.
It is. But just as Nyland is evaluating whether to believe her, there is a massive commotion downstairs. Someone is frantically trying to force their way into the house past the other officers. And when Barry hears the voice of the woman downstairs demanding entry, her reaction is fascinating.
What does she do?
She gives a sharp cry, physically slips past the armed deputy, and practically flees down the stairs.
Which is a brilliant behavioral anomaly for the reader to chew on. Why is her immediate, instinctual reaction to run away from the safety of an armed police officer and sprint toward the voice of this newly arrived woman?
We later learn that the woman downstairs is her mother, Caroline King. But in that moment, it is such an incredible hook. Imagine you are walking into this chaotic, bloody scene right now. The author is essentially forcing you to play detective alongside Deputy Nyland.
You're weighing all the evidence in real time?
Right. You're evaluating every single physical clue. The lipstick on the wine glasses, the pool of blood on the rug, the unspent bullets in a hidden revolver, and simultaneously, you're evaluating every psychological reaction. Is Barry's rocking a sign of pure, unadulterated shock, or is it the manic energy of guilt? Why is she running?
You are entirely immersed in the puzzle.
And just as your adrenaline is peaking and you are demanding answers, the author executes a hard cut to a completely different location, a completely different tone to start chapter 1.
This is a foundational thriller pacing mechanism. You introduce a high-stakes, violent mystery, you present a series of contradictory clues, and then you deliberately deny the reader immediate resolution by aggressively shifting the perspective.
It's so frustrating, but so effective.
Exactly. It forces the reader to carry the anxiety of the prologue into a completely unrelated setting.
So we transition away from the bloody lake house in Texas and move to Atlanta, Georgia. It is the middle of the night. We are introduced to Dodge Hanley, who is violently pulled out of a deep sleep by his cell phone ringing at 2 in the morning.
And immediately, within just a few sentences, the author establishes Dodge's gritty, deeply cynical persona.
Oh, yeah. He doesn't even bother to open his eyes to answer the phone. He sleeps in pitch darkness, and his very first instinctual action upon waking is to blindly reach for a pack of cigarettes on the nightstand.
That tells you so much right there.
It does. He uses his lips to pull a cigarette from the pack, then flicks his lighter. We learn through his internal monologue that he lives in an undisclosed location. He prefers to keep an incredibly low profile. He operates strictly on a cash basis. And he is so secretive that even his own boss doesn't know his home address.
He's a ghost.
Basically, this is a man who has constructed a life entirely in the shadows by deliberate design.
So what does Dodge's physical reaction to the phone call tell us about his internal state? The voice on the other end of the line asks if she has reached Dodge Hanley. He is incredibly reluctant to confirm his identity, finally grunting a non-committal, yeah. And then the caller says, this is Caroline. Caroline King.
The exact same name tied to the 911 call at the Bloody Lake House.
Right. But look closely at Dodge's physical reaction to hearing that specific name. The sheer, unadulterated shock of it makes his lighter slip right through his fingers and fall to the floor.
That is a huge tell for a guy like him.
Massive. Dodge Hanley is established as a hardened investigator, a guy who voluntarily lives off the grid and deals with the absolute dregs of society on a daily basis. And yet, hearing two simple words, Caroline King, completely paralyzes his nervous system.
He can't even process it.
He can barely form a coherent sentence. He just keeps repeating the word yeah over and over again. He experiences a total cognitive shutdown, his heart rate shoots off the charts, and he suddenly feels like he can't breathe. The author uses this sudden physical failure to establish a massive, deep, entirely unresolved history between these two characters without dumping a single paragraph of exposition on the reader.
Show don't tell at its finest.
Exactly. We know instantly, just from the dropped lighter, that Caroline King is the one structural weakness in Dodge Hanley's otherwise impenetrable armor.
It's such an elegant way to deliver backstory. He assumes, given the time of night and the decades of silence, that she must be dying to be calling him, but she calmly tells him she has a situation. Trouble. She asks him to come to Houston immediately.
And Dodge's instinct is to immediately throw up his emotional defenses.
Right away. He gets angry, he gets sarcastic, he deflects by asking about her husband, and she drops the bomb that her husband passed away years ago. Dodge is so disconnected from her life that he didn't even know she was a widow.
That really underscores the distance between them.
It does. He pushes back hard, flat out refusing to go, telling her she's given him absolutely zero actionable information. He's hostile and combative. And Caroline responds with this sharp peak saying, "I'm not asking you to help me, Dodge." And then she delivers the hook that shatters his resistance. She says, "It's Barry who's in trouble."
Which provides a seamless thematic transition to the next scene, where we get to see Dodge Hanley completely and utterly out of his element.
Yeah, the next morning, Dodge goes to the spectacular home of his boss, Derek Mitchell, who is a high-powered, highly successful defense attorney. And the contrast the author creates in this scene is just Beautiful, almost comedic.
He really is.
You have Dodge, this cynical, nicotine-fueled lone wolf who basically operates in the moral gray areas of the justice system,
Mhm.
stepping into a world of absolute, unapologetic, cozy domestic bliss.
Notice how the text is employing domestic tranquility as a foil for the second time here. In the prologue, the cozy living room highlighted the horror of the violence upstairs.
Yeah.
Here, Derek's kitchen is used for stark character contrast, emphasizing just how broken and isolated Dodge truly is.
It highlights his isolation perfectly.
Hmm.
Derek and his wife Julie are in their well-used, beautifully organized, sunlit kitchen. Julie is dealing with a bout of morning sickness, which Derek is happily nerdily explaining the biology of, much to Dodge's absolute disgust.
She just wants to escape.
They're using actual cloth napkins. Julie warmly offers Dodge a slice of homemade pound cake. Derek is casually pulling Julie onto his lap and affectionately nuzzling her neck. It is sickeningly sweet and intimate, especially if you are Dodge handling.
Is his worst nightmare.
Dodge is sitting there in his unshined shoes, practically vibrating with anxiety, patting his pocket for a cigarette he knows he absolutely cannot light in their pristine kitchen, just wishing he was anywhere else on the planet.
The psychological weight of this interaction is palpable. Dodge has come to his boss's house to formally ask for vacation time, but Dodge never, ever takes vacation. He is a textbook workaholic who uses his relentless, gritty investigations to avoid dealing with the vacuum of his own personal life.
And Derek knows that better than anyone.
Derek Mitchell is a razor-sharp trial lawyer. In fact, he actually cross-examined Dodge relentlessly on the witness stand years ago. That's the crucible in which they met and eventually formed a working relationship. Derek possesses uncanny, predatory intuition, and he sees right through Dodge's clumsy lie immediately.
He's not buying the vacation story for a second.
Not for a second.
Hmm.
He knows Dodge isn't going to a tropical island to relax. He flat out refuses to let Dodge leave the house until he tells them what kind of trouble he is actually walking into.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Dodge is completely backed into a corner by Derek and Julie's genuine, unrelenting concern. He can fight off hostility, but he doesn't know how to fight off people who actually care about him.
That's his real kryptonite.
He finally breaks. He blurts out that he's going to, quote, buttfuck Texas. When they press him on what possible business he has in rural Texas, he tries to brush it off, physically tries to leave, and even pours his coffee down the drain in frustration. But they act as an immovable object. Finally, staring down at his unshined shoes, defeated, he admits who he is going to see. His daughter.
This is the narrative bombshell that forces the reader to aggressively recontextualize every single thing they read in the prologue.
Derek is stunned into silence. He looks at Dodge and says, "You don't have a daughter." And Dodge replies, with all the weight of the world, "Yeah, I do." He admits he has had a daughter for 30 years, and he hasn't laid eyes on her since her actual birthday, the exact day she was born.
When you take this revelation and map it back onto the events of the lake house, the puzzle pieces snap together with a devastating emotional click. The traumatized, freckled girl rocking in the bathroom, Barry Malone, the one who was almost murdered, the one hiding the .38 revolver that is Dodge Hanley's estranged daughter.
It's a huge reveal.
And Caroline King, the wealthy woman who owns the lake house, the woman who ran screaming past the police to get to Barry, is her mother. The woman Dodge hasn't spoken to in 3 decades. This completely explains why Caroline didn't just rely on the regular local police for help with this situation. She called Dodge because she knows this specific crisis requires someone with a very particular, ruthless set of skills. The skills of a hardened, cynical investigator who isn't bound by the bureaucratic, button-down rules of a standard police department.
It is a phenomenal character setup. Have you ever considered what it would take for a past obligation to suddenly and violently pull a person out of a carefully constructed, isolated life, something they thought was buried forever, suddenly resurfacing and demanding their immediate, lethal attention?
It's the ultimate disruption.
For a deeply flawed, avoidant character like Dodge, this is the ultimate call to adventure. He is being summoned to protect the adult child he abandoned by the woman he clearly never managed to get over. It's a masterful, emotional framework to lay over a procedural thriller plot.
It fundamentally shifts the entire genre of the narrative. It raises the stakes of the thriller exponentially. It's no longer just a procedural story about catching a bad guy. It's a deeply personal, tragic story about whether this broken man can somehow find redemption in the eyes of the family he walked away from, all while navigating a highly volatile, lethal situation.
Which brings us perfectly to the actual nature of that lethal situation. We've seen the bloody aftermath of the violence in Texas, and we've seen the profound emotional fallout of the phone call in Atlanta. Now, the author pulls us back to Merritt County to unpack the actual psychology of the crime that set all of this in motion. Let's head to chapter 2.
Back to the scene of the crime, or rather, the aftermath.
Exactly. We are at the Merritt County Courthouse, specifically gathered in Sheriff Tom Drummond's office. And again, the setting details ground us in a very specific, inescapable reality. It's an imposing 1898 structure. There is wavy antique glass in the windows, original dark wood paneling, and a massive painting of Santa Anna's surrender to Sam Houston hanging prominently between the state and national flags. It is the visual personification of old-school Texas justice.
The careful curation of the cast of characters inside this room represents all the different, often conflicting facets of a criminal investigation.
Break that down for us.
Well, you have Barry, the traumatized survivor and the primary witness, still processing her near-death experience. You have Caroline, the fiercely protective, affluent mother who's used to controlling her environment. You have their retained lawyer, Harris Carlisle, who the text describes as shrewd with bright, calculating black eyes. He is sitting there specifically to protect Barry from any aggressive police overreach.
He's a shield.
Right. Then you have the calm, diplomatic Sheriff Drummond, who represents the political face of local law enforcement. And finally, you have Deputy Ski Nyland, who the author makes a very specific point to describe as looking exactly like a rodeo cowboy in his crisp white shirt, worn jeans and boots, casually hiding his sidearm. He represents the skeptical, boots-on-the-ground operational arm of the law.
They are all gathered in this historic room to go over Barry's official statement and try to get a clear, actionable picture of the man who broke into the lake house and attacked her. And this is where the author delivers a truly chilling, non-traditional profile of the stalker, Orrin Starks.
This is where things get really psychological.
Barry explains to the room that she met Orrin at her previous job at Delray Marketing down in Houston. She notes that Orrin was eventually fired because management decided he wasn't a good fit. But when Deputy Nyland leans in and presses her on whether Orrin was actually competent at his job, Barry gives this weary half smile and says something that completely shifts the tone of the interrogation.
What is her specific assessment of his professional capabilities?
She looks right at Nyland and says, Orrin wasn't good at his job, he was exceptional. And she goes on to explain that corporate marketing is fundamentally about complex strategy. It's about making dozens of disparate components form a single harmonious whole. Orrin was the agency's undisputed go-to guy whenever a massive campaign was failing. Why? Because Orrin obsessively loves puzzles. He has a brilliant, hyper-analytical knack for isolating the exact single piece of data that doesn't fit the established pattern.
This raises an important question, one that the narrative practically demands the reader to sit with. How does a brilliant, exceptional, highly functional puzzle-solving mind transition into an unhinged, violent stalker?
It's a terrifying jump.
It is, because the text makes it abundantly clear that Orrin's brand of stalking wasn't the stereotypical screaming outside your window, slashing your tires variety. It was incredibly insidious and calculated. Barry notes that he never, ever left a paper trail.
No explicit texts.
None. There were no officially filed sexual harassment complaints with HR. There was no overt, inappropriate touching in the break room. And there were no explicit, obscene text messages that the police could easily print out to trap him. He was far too intelligent for that.
So how did he do it?
Instead, he relied on a constant barrage of passive-aggressive innuendo. He would make subtle remarks that implied a deep, secret intimacy that simply didn't exist. And if you were trying to call him on it, he was clever enough to twist the words backward and gaslight you, making you feel like you were the one who was crazy and misinterpreting a totally innocent comment. It's a deeply psychological, highly manipulative form of terror that isolates the victim from their peers.
It's exactly the kind of creeping stalking that makes the victim feel completely insane long before it makes them feel physically in danger. But of course, the obsession escalated.
It always does.
Barry lists the specific gifts he sent her over time, and they paint a terrifying picture of a deeply obsessive, hyper-focused mind. He sent her a Dungeons & Dragons-style fantasy video game, a game featuring wizards, sorcerers, castles, and intricate mazes. A game entirely built around complex puzzles, traps, and controlling the narrative.
That's a massive red flag regarding his worldview.
Totally. He sent her a massive best-selling book that he claimed he stood in line for hours to get personally inscribed for her. He gave her a custom-burned CD full of specific songs.
Yep.
And most personal and violating of all, he gave her a delicate silver chain featuring a single heart charm.
If we analyze the escalation of these gifts, it's classic textbook stalker behavior, but it's executed by a mastermind who views human interaction as a game. Barry tried desperately to return the gifts, but he completely ignored her refusals, essentially forcing her to either keep the items or engage in a confrontation with him.
Which is a lose-lose for her.
Exactly, because that is exactly what he wanted: engagement. Any attention, even negative attention, feeds the obsession. It eventually got to the point where he would just be casually sitting on her front porch when she got home from work, or mysteriously showing up at restaurants across town exactly when she was eating there. The presence became so suffocating, so omnipresent and terrifying, that Barry literally fled her entire life in Houston.
She just dropped everything.
She quit her job, abandoned her apartment, and went into deep hiding at her mother's secret unlisted lake house out in the country, just praying she could disappear long enough to make him lose interest and find a new puzzle.
But Oren is the ultimate puzzle solver. He is the guy whose entire identity is built on finding the missing piece. He managed to track her down to a remote, unlisted location in the middle of a 900-square-mile forested county. And that leads us back to the terrifying climax of the prologue, which Barry is now narrating in excruciating detail for the sheriff's room.
The bathroom scene.
Yes, she tells them she was in the shower. And Oren suddenly rips open the curtain, absolutely invoking that classic psychocinematic trope. But instead of a butcher knife, he's pointing a loaded gun directly at her face. She describes his demeanor as completely unhinged. He is sputtering, he's wild-eyed, he's relentlessly chanting at her, repeating the phrase, "I must kill you." You realize that, don't you? I've got to kill you. I don't have a choice.
The specific linguistic choices he makes here are critical to understanding his pathology.
Yeah.
I must. I don't have a choice. It strongly implies that he is psychologically bound by a rigid set of internal rules that only he understands. In his twisted puzzle-solving mind, the mathematical equation of their relationship has reached a point where it absolutely requires Barry's death in order to be balanced. He sees himself as a captive to the logic of the maze he has built.
Barry screams in absolute terror. Ben Lofland, who had been downstairs casually cleaning up after they cooked steaks on the grill, hears her scream and comes sprinting up the stairs to the bathroom. Oren hears him charging in, violently spins around, and shoots Ben point blank, which is the gunshot that leaves Ben bleeding out on the peach rug when Nyland arrives.
The chaos in that moment must have been overwhelming.
And Barry tells the room that she experienced this bizarre, surreal sense of timelessness in that moment, a feeling of complete suspended animation where her brain couldn't process the violence. But then Oren does something totally unexpected, something that breaks all the rules of the situation. He turns and runs away.
This is the massive, glaring gap in logic that Deputy Nyland, relying on his sharp investigator instincts, immediately hones in on during the interrogation.
Barry explains that after Oren ran, she climbed out of the tub, told a bleeding Ben that she was going to get help, and ran out to the second-floor gallery overlooking the living room. She sees Oren rushing frantically down the stairs. He completely loses his footing, falls all the way down to the hardwood floor on the ground level, and lands hard on his back, visibly injuring his leg.
So he's hurt and vulnerable now.
Right. He looks up from the floor, sees Barry watching him from the railing upstairs. He points his gun up at her, and Barry throws herself flat onto the floor as Oren empties his entire remaining clip, firing wildly up at the ceiling and the railing. Miraculously, he misses every single shot. He screams up at her that he will eventually kill her, that she absolutely must die, and then he staggers out the front door into the night without bothering to reload.
Nyland is sitting in the sheriff's office listening to this narrative, and you can practically see the wheels spinning furiously behind his gray eyes. He immediately challenges the logic of the story. He looks at Barry and says, "Let me get this straight. Ben Lofland is down and out of the fight. You were completely alone, naked, and defenseless in a slippery bathtub. Starks is standing point blank over you with a loaded gun, actively chanting that he absolutely must kill you. So why didn't he do it?
It's the million-dollar question.
Why did he shoot the intervening boyfriend and then immediately turn his back and run away, only to fire wildly from 30 feet below at a terrible obstructed angle after falling down a flight of stairs?" Nyland bluntly states to the room, "Doesn't make sense to me." The sheriff tries to smooth it over, writing it off as the guy simply chickening out at the sight of blood or having a moment of panic. But Nyland is entirely unconvinced. The math of the puzzle solver does not add up for the deputy.
What do you make of this discrepancy? Is Sheriff Drummond's assessment correct? Did this meticulous, brilliant, calculating marketing guy simply lose his nerve when the physical reality of murder broke through his fantasy? Or is Deputy Nyland right to be deeply suspicious of the narrative? Is this chaotic flight actually part of a much darker, far more complex game designed by a man who literally views the world as a Dungeons and Dragons maze?
The author leaves that ambiguity hanging incredibly heavy in the air of the sheriff's office, and it perfectly highlights the severe vulnerability of the local law enforcement forces. As Nyland points out during the meeting, Merritt County encompasses 900 square miles of dense, virgin pine forest, and the entire sheriff's department consists of exactly 12 people.
That's nothing for an area that size.
It's terrifyingly inadequate. And that number includes the courthouse bailiff, the county jailer, and a rewired school teacher who just helps out with the administrative paperwork. They are severely, almost comically under-resourced to hunt down a highly intelligent, highly motivated, well-funded predator who has already proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that he can vanish without leaving a single trace.
Which perfectly sets the stage for why the introduction of Dodge Hanley is an absolute necessity. Let's move into Chapter 3, which is all about the explosive collision of past and present. Dodge has flown from Atlanta into Houston, rented a car, and is currently making the long, grueling drive north into the heart of East Texas. The author uses the shifting physical geography of the drive to brilliantly mirror Dodge's deteriorating internal journey.
The environment doing the heavy lifting again.
Always. He leaves the flat, barren plains and endless concrete of Houston behind and slowly enters the dense, claustrophobic shadows of the East Texas pine forests. He's driving past dilapidated bait shops, neon taxidermy signs, and dusty RV campgrounds. He's entering a world entirely foreign to his cynical, fast-paced urban existence.
And his internal monologue during this drive is absolutely agonizing to read. He is battling severe, visceral, almost paralyzing anxiety. He is furiously cursing the touchscreen keyboard on his cell phone because his fingers are too big to type properly. He's relentlessly chain-smoking in a sealed rental car, and he's actively, desperately fantasizing about just turning the car around and abandoning the mission.
He just wants out.
He imagines driving straight to the airport and flying down to Mexico for cheap tequila and brown-eyed ladies, or disappearing to a remote Caribbean island to just get completely tanked and forget this whole nightmare ever happened. The primal instinct to run away, the exact same instinct he followed 30 years ago when Barry was born, is overwhelmingly powerful.
But against all his worst instincts, he keeps driving. Because Caroline sent him a brief text message with directions to a specific meeting place, Mabel's Tea Room. And the environmental contrast here is just spectacular. It borders on comedic if the underlying emotional stakes weren't so incredibly high.
It's such a brilliant setting choice.
Dodge, a man who literally describes his own physical presence as feeling like a lumbering woolly mammoth, walks into a hyper-feminine, delicate tea room. There are lacy white curtains on the windows, bright pink geraniums blooming in whitewood planters, a little brass bell that jangles cheerfully over the door when he enters, and a menu that prominently features things like apricot scones and clotted cream.
It's the ultimate exaggerated fish-out-of-water scenario, but it also serves a very specific, strategic, psychological purpose for Caroline. She deliberately chose a public place she had never even been to before, precisely because she knew the emotion of this reunion could be explosive and volatile. She wanted a completely neutral, highly public ground with a quiet atmosphere to guarantee that Dodge couldn't make a scene or lose his temper. The tea room acts as an emotional containment vessel.
Dodge walks in and his heart essentially stalls in his chest. He spots her sitting alone at a small table in the back. And this is the moment that has been 30 years in the making. He's been terrified for the entire drive of how his hard living will look to her, how his endless vices, the alcohol, the cigarettes, the stress, have carved deep lines into his face. But when he finally looks across the room at Caroline, he sees that she is still breathtakingly, effortlessly beautiful.
Of course she is.
She still has the exact same cinnamon-colored hair and deep sherry-colored eyes. He instantly remembers a cheesy pickup line he used on her decades ago when they were young. Cinnamon and sherry, you look good enough to eat. The author shows us in this brief moment that Dodge hasn't just remembered her casually. He has preserved her perfectly, like an insect in amber, in his mind for 3 decades.
But the tension sitting between them at that tiny table is incredibly thick, and it is mostly communicated through what is left unsaid. There is no warm embrace, there is no hug, there is just a firm, incredibly brief, single handshake. And then the sheer, suffocating awkwardness of the tea room setting forces its way into the interaction.
The waitress comes over.
The cheerful waitress approaches the table. Carol orders a pot of Darjeeling tea. Dodge, completely out of his depth and desperate for something familiar, aggressively asks for a regular Coke. And when the waitress returns, it's not in a standard aluminum can. It's presented in a pristine vintage glass bottle, accompanied by a crystal glass of ice, sitting perfectly centered on a little china plate with the delicate white paper doily underneath it.
Dodge doesn't even want to reach out and touch the glass because he's terrified his shaking hands will break something. It's such a brilliant, tangible, physical manifestation of exactly how fragile their entire dynamic is. They sit there, and the conversation is halting, full of false starts and painful pauses. She politely asks about his life back in Atlanta. He gives her the absolute bare bones. The resume version: he joined the police force, eventually got sick of the button-down rules and the bureaucracy, and became a private investigator working for a slick defense attorney.
Very guarded.
Very. She asks, with a hint of trepidation, if he ever married, and he just lets out a harsh laugh and says, "Don't I wish?" And then, in a moment of quiet bravery, she admits that she had secretly hoped he would have utilized his investigative skills to keep track of her over the years.
And Dodge's response to that admission is absolutely heartbreaking in its brutal brevity. He looks at her and says, "I did, for a while. Then I stopped." When she gently presses him and asks if he simply lost interest in them, he replies, "Lost hope."
Oof, that line hits hard.
It does. And it's that sudden flash of intense vulnerability, that raw, unvarnished admission of total emotional defeat, that suddenly makes the air in the tiny tier room feel far too thin for him to breathe. He immediately panics and reverts to his defensive, aggressive posture, gruffly demanding to know if smoking is allowed in the building. When Carolyn remarks on his relentless smoking habit, he makes a dark joke that he only inhales deeply because smoking normally takes too long to get the necessary nicotine into his bloodstream.
Classic deflection.
But she quietly, devastatingly points out that he started smoking exactly 30 years ago, the precise time he walked out on her and their newborn daughter.
So what does this all mean for the narrative moving forward? We have this incredibly volatile, combustible mix of characters currently sitting at a tiny, fragile table decorated with a paper doily. A man who abandoned his fundamental responsibilities to his family 3 decades ago is now sitting across from the only woman he ever truly loved, the woman he spent a lifetime trying to forget and failed. And she's pouring weak tea from a porcelain pot painted with delicate pink flowers, desperately trying to keep her hands from shaking as she prepares to tell him the harrowing, bloody details of how their estranged daughter, Barry, was nearly murdered in her own bathtub the night before by an unhinged mastermind.
By the end of this third chapter, the author has perfectly, meticulously set the board for the rest of the novel. Think about the incredible complexity of the pieces currently in play. You have a local police force that is dedicated and well-meaning, but vastly under-resourced and out of their depth when dealing with the sprawling 900-square-mile forested terrain. You have a stalker, Orrin Starks, who's not just a standard violent threat, but a highly intelligent, deeply obsessive puzzle solver who has already completely evaded detection and clearly has a complex, terrifying endgame in mind.
And then you have Barry.
Yes, you have a traumatized survivor in Barry who is just beginning to realize the true depths of the danger she is in. And entering into the absolute center of this highly volatile, explosive mix, you have Dodge Hanley, a guilt-ridden, chain-smoking investigator from Atlanta who operates entirely outside the boundaries of the law, who is desperate for a final chance at redemption, and who might just be the only person ruthless, cynical, and broken enough to actually outsmart a monster like Orrin.
It is a phenomenal, structurally perfect setup for a psychological thriller. Over the course of this deep dive, we've explored exactly how Sandra Brown constructs her signature suspense, starting with a bloody, chaotic crime scene that immediately subverts your basic expectations of a safe sanctuary. We've delved into the deep, unsettling psychological profiles of both a terrifying, calculating stalker and a deeply flawed, reluctant hero. And we've watched the emotional wreckage of a shattered family be violently forced back together by the sheer gravity of a life-or-death situation. It's a true masterclass in weaving deep, painful character history directly into the propulsive forward momentum of a thriller plot.
And crucially, it leaves us with so many compelling narrative threads to pull as the story progresses. The sheer precision of the author's details is what makes the anxiety of these opening chapters linger in the mind long after you stop reading.
I completely agree. The next time you are consuming a piece of media, whether it's a best-selling novel, a tense movie, or even a true crime documentary, I want you to pay close, analytical attention to those specific, seemingly minor details the creator chooses to highlight. The unspent bullets sitting silently in a hidden revolver. The deliberate, strategic choice of a frilly tier room for a tense, heartbreaking emotional reunion. the seemingly harmless, puzzle-based gifts delivered by a strange coworker. That is where the real terrifying story actually lives. The true tension isn't just in the loud explosion of the gunshot. The tension is in noticing the lipstick on the wine glass right before the trigger is pulled.
I'd like to leave you with a final provocative thought based on the narrative we've unpacked today. We know Orrin Starks is a verified master of puzzles. We know he fundamentally loves mazes, complex strategy, and finding the one piece of data that doesn't fit the established pattern. And we know, thanks entirely to Deputy Nyland's sharp, skeptical observation, that Orrin actively chose not to shoot Barry when he had her completely trapped and at his absolute mercy in that bathtub. What if his frantic, seemingly clumsy flight down the stairs wasn't a moment of panic at all? What if deliberately leaving Barry alive, intentionally slipping away into the dark night, and purposely setting the under-equipped local police force on a massive wild goose chase through a 900-square-mile pine forest? What if all of that is exactly the twisted Dungeons & Dragons-style maze he intended to create all along? What if the Stalker's game hasn't gone wrong? What if the Stalker's game has just officially begun?
That is an incredibly chilling possibility to consider. I will leave you to ponder the implications of that theory. Thank you for taking this intense, deep dive into the narrative with us today. Keep your eyes open, keep analyzing the intricate details around you, and always keep questioning the hidden psychological motives behind the stories you encounter. We'll see you next time.